Europeans are imagining the world in ways that suit them, and there aren't any indigenous voices.
It's very heartening to hear, to see so many people in the audience. And I especially wanted to spend some time thanking Leah and Noemi for what was a really generous invitation to me. I'm a grad student at Northwestern. I'm writing my dissertation. This is going to be the first chapter of that dissertation. And if you've read the great catalog, you know that the two curators paired a younger scholar with an elder scholar. And I had the great joy of being paired with Ricardo Padrón, who is certainly like a kind of hero in my field. And now we get to be friends. So thank you for making that happen. All right. All right, I'm manning 3 computers here, so bear with me for a moment. Here we go. All right, so I thought that I would spend my time today with what may appear to be a relatively simple task. It is actually quite complicated, and that is read this map. I think it's complicated because this map presents itself as a topographical map, but if we go down that route, we will not end up in our destination. So I'll first start by saying that this was a document that was produced in 1569 as a evidence in a court case. And I'll get to that court case later on. But I'm mentioning it now to say that what a Spanish judge understood as a sort of painted image of a landscape with map-like qualities that kind of mapped space was equally a text, and it is written in pictographs or glyphs. So I'm going to unpack those glyphs, some of those symbols in here. Maps that are written in Nahua, which is the written and spoken language of the Mexica people that are known as the Aztec. So maps written in Nahua operate on fundamentally different cartographic systems than territorial maps. They often compress space into the shape of the paper in which they are drawn. And they also emphasize history, the historical significance on a place over geographic accuracy. As such, we need to sort of shift our orientation and our approach to Indigenous maps to make them legible as text and images and cartographic representations. So as we're operating through systems of abbreviation and compression, Nahua maps kind of function as archives that compress history into a document. And maps also serve as indexes to that archive that is built into the land. Indigenous practices and management systems shaped the land and water of central Mexico. And these systems were in the process of being erased, destroyed, and overwritten by the Spanish who were newly arrived in this place. So in this way, I'm going to say tonight that learning to read a Nahua map or learning how to forget to read a Nahua map in the process of becoming acculturated into Spanish life is very much a question of race. So I'm going to focus on what's represented here from an Indigenous perspective to allow me to search for traces of what is not there anymore. So just as this map reveals, well, we're looking at a map of land, for instance, but when we see land, we're not seeing water. Because this is what the area around Mexico City looked like when the Spanish arrived. Can I get my, and our map, how do I get that guy out of the way? There we go. Our map is in this area right here, which you can see is the sort of top of this lake. And if we go back up, if I can figure this out. you can see here that each of these churches has a name. So we're looking at San Miguel, which is the renamed Saltocan. Here's Santa Maria Navitatas, the Tultepec. And here's the land of Cuautitlan. So I want to show you where those are. So this is Cuautitlan. And then we're going to jump back over here because these two maps actually don't accurately, you need to put them together to figure out this space. Here's Zaltocan, it is islands. But you notice in our map, we're not looking at an island. And Tultepec is up here near Zumpango. So why, if this is the original map of what we call now Mexico City, before the arrival of the Spanish, so we're talking 1491. And this is circa 1569. What happened to the water? Well, it starts with Zaltocan. If you go to Cortez's early letters, he writes about, we went into the town and we had to raise it to the ground. So this is an early town that Cortez destroys in the process of making his march down to the Tenochtitlan right here, the capital, again, an island. These are man-made islands. And so what happened after Cortez assumes control of the area is that that area is split up between all of the conquistadors. They become, these lands enter into what is called the encomienda system. So this area right here gets given to Cortez's right-hand man. His name is Gil Benavides y Avila. He passes on. He passes that land on, this encomienda that encompasses Zampango, Zaltican, etc., to his sons, who, being friendly with Cortez's son, attempt to overthrow the crown. Instead, they get beheaded. Those lands pass on to his widow, one of the son's widows, and she auctions it off to pay her way to go back to Spain. So we are talking about the breakdown of the encomienda system a couple generations early into Spanish conquest. And then what happens, this is our area. So this is what it looks today like on a Google map. So you can see that it's actually quite well, it doesn't look like a large space. It's actually like 25 miles between these individual churches. So if we're used to reading a map, like we're used to reading a map, we might see this and say, this is a town with many churches. But in fact, each one of those churches was its own town. And this is, again, this example of how the compression system in Nahuatl written language functions. As an encomiendero, Avila would have been responsible for building churches for each community that he was obliged to. It would have been his responsibility to also supply a Franciscan priest to serve, and that's also why we see church names like San Francisco, to teach the laws of Christianity to the rules, the people that he was consigned to kind of be an overlord over. So where Cuautitlan and Zaltocan are identified by these Spanish texts like San Miguel, Zaltocan, there are other texts in there that this church is actually its own way of marking, is its own text itself. So the manner in which the indigenous mapmaker drew this church clip indicates that the Nahuatl pictorial word was equally bound to these signifiers of Spanishness. All 5 churches are represented by the same general shape. They all have this deep red plot. That's a product of the pigment that is being used. Each is depicted with a gabled roof with 3 windows positioned along the side, an arched doorway. All of these are architectural features that were imported to New Spain by its Spanish occupants. And that arch contrasts with these native architecture, these little houses, which are these like pier and lintel door frames. So if these are, sorry, multiple computers. If these are all individual towns, then these are all different communities that are surrounding each church. So that's one way in which compression works. So I mentioned the Benavides and Avila children align with Cortez, they lose their lands, they lose their lives. And it's up to the widow to decide how she's going to deal with all of these lands. What she ultimately does is partition them off for auction. Perfect timing. We're talking now, we're about in the 1530s. And this is around the time that we have a new kind of Spanish power system coming into play. After this kind of like repeated attempts to establish Spain as an independent colony from France under Spanish overlords, they start sending in mercedes, people who could live on the land and kind of own it as parcels that become known as estancias. So one of the people who buys one of the widow's estancias is a man named Covarrubias. And this is where the map in the Newberry Library gets his name. Covarrubias was a Spanish rancher. He was more specifically a sheep rancher. So I should mention before that that widow had 8,000 heads of sheep recorded in her inventory. That is one ranch. There's a wonderful resource called The Plague of Sheep that talks about how the importation of Spanish sheep led ultimately to the transformation of this place from a fertile valley into the desert that we know it today. So I'll give you an example of what this looks like. So we're looking at the border of Egypt and Israel. On the left is Egypt, overgrazed. On the right, Israel, complete with a wild diversity of trees, plants, microflora. And so this is an example of what sheep do. So if you are a new sheep in a new place that has never been grazed upon before, because if we're talking about the importation of sheep, we're also talking about the importation of agrarian and ranching systems in a place that didn't have a domesticated animal structure. Those sheep go wild. Let me give you some numbers. Here's our sheep. This is the Iberian Chura, and he's the subject of my dissertation. By 1569, the year our map is made, 24% of the highlands that surround Zumpango, that was that most northern town, were transformed into a pasture that held up to 200,000 sheep. By the time this map was made, the highlands were half pasture, supporting upwards of 700,000 heads. So mutton, like pork, beef, poultry, goat, rice, wheat, grapes, orange, these are all staples of the 16th century Iberian diet. And all of these items had been imported to the Americas. There's another scholar, Alfred Crosby, and he reports that by 1571, there were 80 wool mills that supplied enough wool for new Spaniards that they could export it back to Spain. So it's not only clothing the colonies, they're producing enough in surplus to also clothe the metropole. Sheepskin was also necessary from extracting silver. And so then we get into this another resource that's happening, resource extraction of the Americas, silver mining. So Covarrubias's ranch is only one of thousands of herds of sheep in the area. And these sheep led to conflict. Now we're up to our court case. Okay. Here he is. And you'll see right under this sheep's pen, we have the words, Es de los Indios. This is the land of the Indians. Up here, empty sheep's pen. And here, I think I just want to point out, this is where the judge wrote his decree for who was going to win in this property lawsuit. So one of the things that I find really fascinating about this map is, why is this area, Es de los Indios, why is it green? Why does it have this other kind of color when everything around it is brown? So I want to just point out some of these plants. This is like a sort of agave, perhaps, or like a maguey, maybe like some sort of, it wouldn't be an aloe. So what do sheep do? They eat the tender grasses. So if you're in a town called Tultepec, let me show you what the tender grasses look like. This is Tule. The town Tultepec is named for this plant. You can see that it's growing from a kind of watery marshland because it is a plant that necessitates water. And this is a plant that would have been used by the people of Tultepec before the Spanish arrived. They would have used that tool to maybe make baskets or other sort of woven mats that they would have contributed as a tribute to the Aztec capital. After the Spanish, they then continue in that production, but then give to the encomiendo system. So as a sheep, you're always going to look for the tender grasses. And what happens when you take out the tender grasses, you pull them out by the roots, and they're not going to come back, which means that plants like this start to take over. So my contention is that this map is brown because this is an area that is grazed by sheep, and that all that is left in the landscape are these hardier, more woodland plants like the mesquite tree or the agave. And that this area, Es de los Indios, is green because it has been protected up until this point from invasion by sheep. So in 1569, the town of Tultepec took this Spanish rancher to court. And I think that any other time it would have resulted in their losing the case. But by 1569, the Viceroy, Mendoza, had seen enough sheep-related court cases to recognize the pattern. There's a lot of them. And the pattern was, the Spanish would assume that, look at the land of the Indians. They have so much more than we are. They are holding back. They are not giving us what we are entitled to from their communities. And by this time, he had realized and seen the devastation. Central Mexico is looking much more like Egypt than it is like Israel. I know this is a complicated thing to say in this moment today, but I mean that in just simply geographic terms. And so he makes a different decision for Covarrubias. Covarrubias loses the case. The farmers of Tultepec win, and this red line here is the boundary that the sheep have to stay in. So the sheep, seen here in invasion of their boundary, now must live here. I'll end by saying what I think is also really interesting about this boundary is this line of agave. This line where the sheep have clearly marked their own boundary left in the ground by the plants. And then here, this really odd shape. So sorry for all of this extra. This really, really odd shape, I find to be very reminiscent of the ways in which the word Tultepec would have been written in pictorial Nahua. This is the glyph for Nahua, and it's a combination of the word for water mountain. That's this blobby kind of green shape. That's the Atepet glyph. And if you think about Nahua culture, the two elements that you needed to constitute a governance or a township are water and a high place. And then here you have the symbol for Tultepec, these 4 reeds of Tul at the top. So I will leave it at that and look forward to talking to you all after.
I'm tempted to use the old Monty Python line, and now for something completely different. Since, as you'll see, Risa and I are operating on kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum. In other words, when we were asked to talk about race, maps, power, Risa decided to pick this manuscript map that comes out of this very, very local setting where the rubber hits the road, where it's really, battles between colonizers and colonized for control of resources. I'm, in a sense, on the other end of some kind of spectrum, the view from the metropolis, where privileged white Europeans are imagining the world in ways that suit them, and there aren't any indigenous voices involved. And our job was, we each came to this with interest, and we had to make it work. And I think we succeeded. So I'll invite you to look at the essay and make up your own mind. But I'd also like to thank Leah for the invitation, the Chicago Map Society for the joint invitation, the Newberry for its hospitality, and also I'll thank Leah for connecting me with Risa, which is proof that arranged marriages do work. So I had a long time interest in these maps by Nicolas de Fer. Nicolas de Fer was the cosmographer or the cartographer to the King of France, right around the turn of the 17th and 18th century, produced an enormous number of maps. And my favorites are this set of 4 maps of the continents, one for America, one for Europe, one for Asia, one for Africa. And what makes them so absolutely wonderful, if you go into the exhibit, the Newberry Library has a set of all 4 of these maps. They've chosen to include in the exhibit the map of Africa. I'm going to give you a little taste of the other 3 maps in this presentation, because what I'm saying in my essay really has to do with what these things are doing as a set. I'm going to use the digitized versions at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, because the versions here at the Newberry are not digitized, making it very difficult to do what I am going to do now, which is to zoom in. The thing that makes these maps so fascinating is that each of them is surrounded by a series of little vignettes. So we have here beavers hard at work near Niagara Falls, but most of the images are actually of people, and they're supposed to be representative of different communities. So here are the Brazilians working at sugar mills. Here are the inhabitants of Chile. In the bottom, the inhabitants of Peru. And each of the maps does this. It takes a continental group, it divides it into its constituent populations, and then gives us a little scene that often tells a story or depicts representative continents or buildings. Now, what I want to get at in my little talk today is really how we need to think of this as something rather new. Because for those of us who love and know maps, there is probably nothing more natural in the world than to divide the world into continents. When we think of any printed atlas, it starts with a general map of the world, and then we usually get a map of each continent preceding the more sort of regional maps. And that's been the structure of the Western Atlas since the genre was invented in the 16th century. But this is not the only way to organize the world or to imagine the world. So let's move to a different image. Those of you who know maps will be familiar with both of the images that are combined into this one picture. On the right-hand side, we see a very schematic version of a medieval mappamundi. In other words, a map of the world, the inhabited world, that depicts it as a disk divided into 3 parts: Asia, Europe, and Africa. This is how the medieval imagination imagined the big island, basically, where human beings and all of creation was to be found. But when the medieval imagination imagined the larger globe on which that island was found, they would have used a map on the left, which divides the globe into a variety of zones. Arctic zones at the end, templadas, templada in English, temperate zones, thank you. Temperate zones in the northern and southern hemisphere, and a torrid zone across the equator. I want to invite you to think of these two maps, not just as different ways of mapping the world, two versions of medieval maps, but I would like to invite you to think of them as what Karen Wigan and Martin Lewis have called metageographies. Some of you may be familiar with this book. It's now more than like 20 years old. The Myth of the Continents, Metageographies, in which these two, one a historian and one a geographer, introduce us to the idea that we always have these schema by which we think of global affairs. We might divide the world into continents. We might divide the world into East versus West. We might divide it Orient and Occident, global North versus global South, first world, second world, third world. And what they're telling us is that these metageographies, these ways of dividing the world, are not necessarily compatible. You know, they're not part of some large system. Each one is a different language that we use in different contexts. So when we're talking about certain things, it might make more sense to think in terms of continents. When we're talking about other things, we might think in terms of global North versus global South. In other words, we switch from one metageography to the other, depending on the topic at hand, right? One of the things that I've become very interested in my own research is the work of other historians who've told us that, you know, when we think, and I should say my field is in the Spanish encounter with the wider world. So a lot of the reading I do is in what used to be called the history of discoveries, history of colonialism, history of encounters. And in a lot of that history, we really obsess with that right-hand map. You know, when Europeans encounter a new world out in the ocean, we get very interested in the idea of how does this tripartite system become a quadripartite system? How do we go from 3 parts of the world to 4 parts of the world? In other words, one that includes America. However, I have a number of colleagues, I'm thinking primarily of Nicolas de Fer, who have made the argument that in the Middle Ages, that left-hand map mattered much more. In other words, when we think of, you know, which of these maps actually function as an important metageography for thinking about the way the world was arranged, the map of the climates was actually the more important one. Why? Because the Middle Ages had inherited concepts from the Greeks about how human beings were made up. All human beings were composites of the 4 elements, of the 4 humors. And one of the things that determined the relative balance of the humors in the human body was precisely the latitude at which you were found and the amount of heat and sunlight to which you were regularly exposed. This meant that for the medieval imaginations, for the Greco-Roman imagination, people who lived in the temperate zone were going to be more like each other than any of them would have been like people south of them or north of them, right? It just so happened that the ideal needle, oh my God, where was it? Greece. Can you imagine it? Was in the ideal location that combined just enough coldness from the north and just enough heat from the south to produce people who were brave and intelligent and capable of self-government in a way that neither the people in the cold or the people in the hot climates were, right? So why is this important? In other words, that map on the left is attached to a system of thinking that explains why people are the way they are and who should govern over whom else, right? So if the people in the temperate zone are both brave and intelligent, the people in the cold zone are very brave, but they're kind of dumb. The people in the south are very clever, but rather timid. This makes the Greeks or anyone from that latitude into the natural masses of those to the north and those to the south. The map on the right, on the other hand, is purely descriptive. It has no explanatory power, right? So in other words, if the Greeks, the Romans, if the Middle Ages, if they were going to make contrast between the way Europeans were and the way Asians were, it wasn't really because they were European or Asian. It was because Europe was mostly cold, Asia was mostly hot, right? So in other words, even though the Greeks thought in terms of the parts of the world, they invented the parts of the world, it didn't matter as much in their notions of human anthropology as the climates did. When does this begin to change? This changes precisely in the early modern period, right? And why does it change? It changes, well, it changes for a lot of reasons. But there's a historian by the name of Francisco Betancourt in his book on racism, who traces how it's during the 16th and 17th century that Europeans start to think of people as Africans, as Asians, as Americans, as Europeans. It's during the early modern period that those continental groupings become more important than the latitudinal positions. And why is this? Well, there are a couple of things going on. One is the fact that when Europeans travel to the Americas, expecting to find people who are very similar to Africans, in other words, who are very dark-skinned, they don't find them, right? And so we have Francisco López de Gómara, one of the major historians of Spanish imperialism, in this sort of throwaway chapter in his History of the Indies that no one pays attention to. He says, isn't it curious that the people who live on this latitude in the Southern Hemisphere are different from the people who live at the same latitude in this other part of the Southern Hemisphere? And then when you go to the Northern Hemisphere and you look at people at the same latitude, they're different from each other too. God knows why, is how the chapter concludes. So in other words, he's calling into question this whole idea of this particular form of environmental determinism that had been so important to the Western tradition and that had been so important to thinking about why Europeans should be the boss of everybody else, right? So empirical evidence is bringing down this theory. But there's something that's even more important, and that's the fact. And this goes back to Risa's chapter, and here you get an extra bonus for attending the talk because I am now about to tell you something that is not in the published essay. Why do the Spanish want to eat mutton? It's not necessarily because they like it. It's not necessarily because they're familiar with it. It's because part of this idea that the humors of your body respond to the environment has to do with what you eat. In other words, if a European moves to the New World and starts to eat a diet that is exactly like those of indigenous people, over the course of several generations, the influence of that diet, the influence of the atmospheric conditions is going to turn you into indigenous people. In other words, white Europeans, over the course of generations, are going to become indistinguishable from the natives. So you have to import, you have to plant grapevines, you have to bring sheep, because you have to eat the food that makes you who you are. You have to keep on eating European food in order to hold on to identity. In other words, the sort of identities that we think of as racial in this older way of thinking, because they're totally malleable. They're totally determined by environment and can change over the generations. So if you're the governing class in the Americas, this idea is very inconvenient because it's telling you that over the course of generations, you are going to lose the characteristics that make you the governing class. And what else? What else? If you are to take enslaved Africans that you purchase or capture on the coast of Africa, and you then move them to temperate climates over the course of generations, they will cease to be these kind of tropical creatures and will become like the inhabitants of temperate climates. So in other words, this old anthropology, an anthropology that was tied to climate, that was tied to latitude, was not terribly useful for a new world, a new globalizing world in which populations were on the move, in which people were moving, Europeans were moving from the temperate zone to tropical areas, and other populations, especially enslaved Africans, were being moved from tropical places, sometimes to temperate. So what happens? Francisco Betancourt tells you that during the 15th through the 18th centuries, there's a shift in the sort of the importance attached to these two metageographies. People stop organizing the world in terms of climates, stop thinking in terms of climates, stop thinking, excuse me, of global human population in terms of climates, and start to favor the system of the continents. They start to think of people as Africans, as Europeans, as Asians, as Americans. And this is happening at the same time that other people are starting to make the argument that the characteristics that we think of as racial, so not only skin color or hair texture, but things like intelligence, the ability to govern rationality, these are not environmental, they're biological, they're inherited. Very convenient for a new globalizing world, because what biological race does for me is it tells me that a white person who moves from Europe to the tropics, their descendants will remain white as long as they don't intermarry with the local population. Enslaved populations will remain slavish, whatever it is that makes them suitable for slavery, they will remain that way as long as they don't intermarry with white. And so what I'm saying in the article, right, is that the continents, it's not just that the continents become more popular, it's that the continents are a solution to a problem. They are a solution to a crisis in this traditional received way of relating space and geography with what we would call racial identity. And the continents become literally the groundwork for the biological notions of race that are emerging in the 17th and the 18th century. So what does this have to do with the de Fer maps? To be honest, I probably could have used any set of continental maps. And here I'm going to introduce another idea. We've talked about metageographies and the way that metageographies change. What I would suggest, following Dennis Wood, we tend to think of maps as representations of territory, representations of idea. Dennis Wood tells us that we were better off thinking of maps as propositions about reality. And so what continental maps, what happens when I take the world and I separate it into continents, is I'm saying that the continents are self-contained units. I'm saying that the continents are the same sort of thing. You know, each one is its own world with its own community, its own characteristics. And I'm making it harder for you to compare latitudes. When I look at a 16th century map of the world, it is easy to tell that Europe is at the same latitude as China, which would suggest that the Chinese are just as rational, just as capable of civilized life as Europeans. And in the 16th century European writing about China says exactly that. The Chinese are white, they're rational, they're basically just like Europeans, except that they're not Christian. Once I take the world and I separate it into continents, and I put Europe on one sheet and Asia on the other sheet, excuse me, there's America, Asia on the other sheet, then it becomes harder to make those latitudinal comparisons. It becomes harder to think in terms of zones, latitudes, and similarities. And it becomes easier to think in terms of differences in terms of continents and the people who call those continents home, right? So thank you for your attention. We look forward to your questions, both Risa and I. And And that's it, the De Fer map. I invite you to look over in the exhibit at the map of Africa and the wonderful vignettes of African kingdoms that surround the cartographic image of the map. Thank you. Oh, just press and hold. It should be working now.
Okay.
Exhibition is up until Saturday. Yeah, let's have them show everyone for listening.
Talk about this world is but at the same time your work is synthesizing of concepts such as the one of America during the early modern period. So can you tell us a little more about how this world of Italian continent with this ideal world of one continent between America?
I'm so glad it's almost like I set you up, Fabian. If you look at the De Fer map, one of the things that it says, oh, excuse me, am I clicking on the wrong? Which one should I be clicking on? There we go. If we look here on this detail in the, where it says the Pacific, it says Mar Oriental, parte de la Grande Pacifique, and what you can't see, which divides Asia from America, right? So in other words, in the 18th century, people still needed to be reminded that Asia and America were different continents and the Pacific was the thing that divided them. That sort of inscription does not appear on any of the other oceans. So when you look at the Atlantic, it doesn't say, you know, the ocean that divides the New World from the Old. The Mediterranean doesn't say the sea that divides. This is the only ocean that has to be identified as something that divides continents. And so what I would say is that I think that the notion of Amerasia is a notion that works in that older model, and it persists through the 16th and 17th century. And it's in the 18th century when we're startling. I think it's in the 18th century when a notion of Asia gets constructed. You know, that's the moment, for example, when the Chinese become yellow, when they get racialized that way. It's when the Japanese become yellow. And that all has to do, I think, with their separation from America on the one side and their sort of subordination to Europe through the continental things. This is what I end up saying in the essay. The essay actually ends up being a lot about how do you tell Europe and Asia apart? And you need continental maps to do that, because in a world map, Europe and Asia is much easier to think of as a continuity across latitude or across longitude. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
I was totally entranced by the way that you were viewing boundaries, specifically in looking at maps. And thinking about how boundaries appear on maps, not as something that is a political reference to individual spaces as abstract, but instead something that's physically manifested in plants or through where animals have been, both in the map that you were looking at from the 16th century, but also that the representation of the boundary between Egypt and Israel today, where we don't need that abstracted line to be drawn to see that border. So this is really a question, because how have you been thinking about that question of boundaries and whether plants or animals can help us to rethink how those?
We've been asked to repeat the question.
Okay. So we've been asked to repeat the question from the Zoomers online. And I'm going to simplify and my understanding of your question is, how do I come to this other understanding of thinking about boundaries through interactions with plants or representations of plants or interactions with plants? So I would say that, trying to think about how this happened. I came to Northwestern with an interest in animal studies. And Leah mentioned that I was a curator, and I have used, at the same time that I had already made an exhibition, and it was called Monarchs, Brown and Native Artists in the Path of the Butterfly. And this is a contemporary art exhibition, so I have two lives here. That was an exhibition that I made in 2017, which, if you remember, was a moment in which, for me, what I remember, two things were happening. On one hand, boundaries around the Standing Rock Reservation. On the other hand, boundaries challenge or the attempt to reinforce the boundary with the border of US and Mexico with a border wall. This is Trump's presidential campaign. And for me, I'm from San Antonio, Texas. And when I say that, I mean, I am from San Antonio, Texas. We are descended from the original people of San Antonio. So I saw these two events and was like, why are these boundaries are seemingly changeable? And they're seemingly changeable in regards to empire and their needs to manage the lives of Native people. And this is when I remembered the monarch butterfly connected Standing Rock to the border wall. And then that butterfly allowed me to think about geography in a completely different way. I brought this to Northwestern, and so then seeing maps like this allowed me to try to think what it might be to think through the sheep's eyes. And sheep don't, like butterflies, don't think about boundaries in the same way. They follow the soft grasses, and they will stop going to the places where the mesquite and the agave have taken over. So I then began to supplement by thinking in Nawa. And so I've been learning Nawa at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which is a beautiful language in the ways in which words are written to inscribe. I gave this example to Ricardo yesterday. So if we were talking about the verb to run, the word pla, which means ground, is embedded in that word. So then we automatically have a relationship between our bodies and the world as we're thinking through language. So the attempt to read a Nawa map also for me became an attempt, because I'm not saying that I'll ever be literate in Nawa, but an attempt to embody that way that language functions and change how you think about the world, which then allows us to think about boundaries differently. Okay.
The Asia.
This one.
That one, right?
Yeah.
It's so the question is about the frontier of Europe on the map of Asia. If you'll let me zoom in. Here, there's all of this descriptive text along the sides, and if you manage to read through of that, what it tells us is that the frontier between Europe and Asia is defined, and I'm having trouble finding a way to zoom this. The frontier of Europe and Asia is defined by a particular river. I think it's the Oder or something like this. And so if we can zoom in on this image, what we'll find is that you get all of this detail until you get to that river, and then it's blank, right? So what's going on here in the Frontière de l'Europe is it's simply indicating that this is where Europe is. The actual border is defined by these rivers along here. So you'll see how all of a sudden we stop getting toponyms to the left. Now, one of the things it's saying is Partie de l'Estate des Arts, you know, one of the problems with that frontier for the Russians was that it cuts Russia in two. It puts part of it in Asia and part of it in Europe. So this is a map that's made prior to the selection of the Ural Mountains as the frontier with Europe and Asia, which was immensely popular in the Russia of Peter the Great, because once you make that boundary the Urals, then all of Russia is European, which is of course what Peter the Great was trying to say. Does that answer your question, David? Yeah.
And be some methodology. The thought about representation and about finishing your degree and moving on professionally with this work. I wonder if you thought about the efficacy of GIS in your work, because you're trying to overlay maps in a way. And so I just wondered where you are with the potential of GIS to help you piece more out of this material.
I really appreciate that as a possibility to investigate in the future, because I tend to be very analog. As you can see from my, let's imagine what these two maps could look like together with this slide. So thank you. And I am really not great with technology, including these sort of basic PowerPoint presentations. And I will find somebody based on your suggestion to help me. Thank you. You do. Ricardo knows a guy.
Thank you.
It's done.
So my question is, while I was listening to your talk, I just couldn't stop to think about what Diana Davis has said about, Diana Davis has said about 19th century Algeria. How the French empire conquered Algeria by making the claim that Algeria was the granary of the Roman Empire, but these backward Arabs had sheep and cattle and they conquered the entire the Algerian desert, and now the time is to remake Algeria as the granary of the Roman Empire in the 19th century. Well, this was the indigenous people of the area. Now, I'm wondering how actually, this reading of this map from this 16th century and the language that has been articulated in the 19th century about these marginalized, so-called marginal areas. What type of conversation do you establish, or do you really want to establish a kind of conversation between these different geographies and time scales, but actually referring to the same kind of or similar questions?
So to repeat the question for the people on Zoom, it's a question of person asking the question is noting a similarity between the logic applied in 16th century Mexico and 18th century Algeria. Yes,
Yeah,
19th century Algeria, and asking where the work is going to go in the future. So I want to start by saying there's already somebody from an ecological perspective who has done cross-comparative work within the sort of Anglophile world. So the same, well, actually, it's comparing the importation of sheep into Spain to the importation of sheep into New Zealand, and that kind of cross-cultural comparison. So that is 16th century Spanish Empire versus like 18th, 19th century English Empire scenario. I'm going to go a different way. I'm going to go north. So what happens with this particular sheep, I'll bring him up. The Iberian Chura follows Coronado and another Spanish conquistador, Oñate, who, in addition to establishing the New Mexico wool trade, also is responsible for an incredible massacre of the Acome people in the 18th century. So what happens with my sheep is that he becomes more than adopted, integrated into the kinship networks of the Dene people, better known as the Navajo, or more colloquially known as the Navajo. And through the experience of living in the Southwest, his body changes. He becomes leggier because he has to navigate more diverse kind of terrain. And what makes this sheep from Spain so important to the Navajo is that his wool is especially is lanolin rich. And so what happens then when you make a blanket from a lanolin rich wool is that it's virtually waterproof. So those blankets that result from this Navajo weaving production become highly prized objects in between Native people and trade. And then after jurisdiction changes, boundaries change, the United States take over kind of jurisdiction of what had been a Spanish colony. Those blankets become really high commodity items in the trading posts. Ultimately, then from this 18th, 19th century movement, I move into the 21st century when those blankets go on display at the Museum of Modern Art in the first exhibition to call Native American art. Because previous to this, they had been anthropological artifacts. So instead of doing a cross comparative across different geographies, I'm staying within the same continent and moving through different times and different ways in which this sheep's wool changes, like jumps borders, jumps disciplinary divides, all while still kind of like the sheep then becomes the link